installation at PAM. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the museum this evening for a lecture in conjunction with the exhibition School of the Forest, Miami campus. This newly commissioned project by Banality of Evil was curated by Renee Morales and is on view on the second floor Diane and Robert Moss Gallery through October 18th of this year. The exhibition recreates an elevated open-air shelter that is common among Amazonian forest communities. This project is based on the Universidad da Floresta, an initiative launched in rural Brazil, which brings theorists and scientists to the museum, from around the world to the Amazon in order to exchange knowledge with local communities and with the goal, the ultimate goal, of imagining sustainable human relationships with nature. Tonight's esteemed guest is Renzo Taddei. He is the fourth scholar to activate our exhibition. He is an assistant professor at the Federal University of Sao Paulo, where he directs the research laboratory on socio-technical and environmental interactions. Dr. Taddei has extensively explored and published on environmental citizenship and on governance in Brazil, and is currently working on the sociological and philosophical dimensions of climate change and climate-related technologies. Tonight, he will specifically explore the topic of alter-geoengineering in a talk entitled Seeing from the Perspective of the End of the World. As a follow-up to this lecture, I invite you to join us tomorrow at 3 p.m. for a free workshop. If you're interested, you can find out more information and register at pam.org. So without further delay, join me in welcoming Dr. Renzo Taddei to the stage.
Thank you. Well, first I would like to thank Maria and Renee and also Camila Spasati for the invitation to participate in this series of seminars and workshops. It is an immense honor to be part of this initiative and to join colleagues whose work I greatly admire. As presented by Mauro Almeida in the first seminar of this series, the project of the School of the Forest is about the integration of different forms of knowledge. Well, it sounds nice, it sounds politically correct, but I want to go much beyond that. I want to argue that this kind of project of knowledge integration is our only hope for the future. And it requires, rather than tries to prevent, the end of some woes that we have historically learned to lack. Nicholas Mirzulev's ideas of visual commons and of direct action, and Elizabeth Povinelli's geontological augmented reality visual projects with the Australian Caribbean, to cite the participants who preceded me in this series of seminars, are, in my understanding, efforts in the materialization of such a new reality. I will construct my argument in a performative, provocative way, evoking science and traditional knowledge as opposite things, just to get them to meet each other at the end, just like the idea of the School of the Forest. The title of my presentation is Seeing from the Perspective of the End of the World. The background over which the argument is constructed includes the following axiomatic elements, which I will not develop in the talk for lack of time, but we can get back to it in the discussion or perhaps tomorrow in the workshop. So the principles are this: seeing creates a perspective. Perspectives creates worlds. Many perspectives imply many worlds, and they are not dissociated from each other necessarily, not as in quantum physics, where in the sense that quantum physics suggests sometimes that you have parallel worlds or alternate worlds. No, we're talking about worlds that very often coexist. and relate to each other in different ways. And this relationship can be symbiosis, it can be parasitism, or it can be war. Mauro made a lot about words and war. Well, all that said, we could ask ourselves, what happens to perspectives when worlds end? And what happens to worlds when perspectives end? In a classic academic understanding of such things, the first is seen as an ecological catastrophe, and the second is understood as genocide. So here I start with bold provocative statements. Throughout the talk, I will try to demonstrate that seeing both things as different from each other is part of the problem. And it is why, among other things, the sciences, and here I include the climate sciences, are incapable of proposing real solutions here. They are concerned with ecological catastrophe, but they are blind to genocide. Particularly perspectival genocide, which the mainstream physical sciences deny the existence altogether. Some of these terms will become clear along my exposition. We'll argue that the end of the world will not be televised. It will also not be in journals like Science and Nature, regardless of the attention they have been paying to climate change. So one question here is whether, due to the work of people like Marietitsa, we can access and deal with it through the arts. And I'll come back to this later in my presentation. So in my talk, I will refer many times to a book that was published last year in Brazil by philosopher Deborah Adanovsky and anthropologist Eduardo Oliveira de Castro, exactly on the question, or should I use the plural, the questions of the end of the world. The book is entitled, Is There Any World to Come? It was published in French and in Portuguese, and the English edition should appear in 2016. In the book, the authors discuss, among many other things, the question of awareness about the end, in this case of the world. So the first thing I would like to address here then is that not all genres of communication, and therefore genres of thinking, are equally good for discussing the end of the world. Actually, given the inappropriateness of some genres for dealing with the theme, for people who live immersed in communication circuits dominated by such genres, there is always the chance that the world has already ended and people did not notice it, or that people have already died and are still not aware of it. So, a first step here is to discuss awareness. What does it mean to be able to perceive something in the world? And what role does our communication networks, our institutions and forms of organization play in this panorama? So in social theory, a key debate has been going for at least 1.5 centuries, and is related to the problem of awareness and consciousness, is the one related to the idea of alienation as proposed by Karl Marx. Now, more recently, German philosopher Hannah Arendt coined the term banality of evil in her analysis of the production of alienation in the techno-bureaucracy of Nazism. Of all debates in alienation, it is this one that interests me here. The banality of evil is a concept she created when writing about the trial of a German Nazi official, Eichmann, who had been captured in Buenos Aires and taken to Israel, where he was prosecuted. At that time, Hannah Arendt lived in New York City, and she went to Israel, invited by the New Yorker magazine, to cover the judgment. She then realized that Eichmann was, in reality, a bureaucrat. During the Nazi years, he was responsible for the logistics of the transportation of millions of Jewish prisoners to concentration camps. In his understanding, all he had done was to press buttons, so to speak. And of course he did it with German efficiency. So he claimed that not having killed anyone, as the prosecutors accused him of, but just to follow orders related to organizational bureaucratic procedures. And later he was condemned and killed. So Hannah Arendt is one of the Jewish intellectuals, together with others like Zygmunt Bauman, and also non-Jewish ones like Anthony Giddens, who say that to reduce the Holocaust to the psychopathic qualities of Hitler is to refuse to see it in its wider implication, and therefore to maintain in place the elements that could produce it again. Nature produces psychopaths systematically, and perhaps it has always done so. Many became powerful, but none in human history at that point had at his disposal the degree of military, technological, and organizational sophistication that Hitler had. The problem is that most nation states not only still have that, they have much more of that. Arendt was right. Genocides continued to occur systematically, although in less visible corners of the globe in what mainstream Western media is concerned. So perhaps the main element in the equation is not the amount of military technology, but the type of consciousness that bureaucracies, such as the one Eichmann was part of, produce. In such bureaucratic apparatuses, people are small fractions in complex systems, and because of that, they lose the awareness of what is going on. Marx made reference to that when he discussed the alienation of the worker in the factory, where the worker cannot relate to the product, but only to fragmented production process and particularly with money. Now, philosopher of science Donna Haraway, inspired by the work of Arendt, suggested that we live in a situation of banality of environmental evil. So what would be banality of environmental evil? It refers to the fact that we live in worlds structured around forms of life, forms of social organization, institutional and collective, among which both academia and journalism have a fundamental role, which desensitizes us to some things in the world and sensitizes us to other things. The fact is that there is a systematic desensitization of our perception patterns in regard to some dimensions of the world. Going back to Hannah Arendt's analysis of Eichmann, this is related to the fact that that bureaucracy desensitized that character to what was going on there. So what is really shocking here is the relevance of this analysis to our current situation, in which we are constantly desensitized in relation to some things. I could very easily say that capitalism is guilty of all of it. And of course, it is guilty of almost all of it. But the problem is larger than capitalism. One argument presented by people who don't think that the term Capitalocene is better than the problematic Anthropocene is the fact that Soviet communism was as environmentally destructive as capitalism, if not more. The same can be said about the political use of Soviet bureaucracies to desensitize individuals. So let me exemplify, this happens all the time in our lives, and so let me exemplify with a much more mundane example. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and I remember when she was 3, my wife and I were trying to teach her how to walk on the sidewalks of Rio de Janeiro, where we lived at that time. And my daughter was perfectly capable of walking, yet using the sidewalks in places like Copacabana is no trivial task. As a curious child, she was always interested in chasing butterflies and exploring colorful things. And we had to tell her all the time that she needed to stop paying attention to the butterflies and instead to watch for the many potholes on the sidewalks, to crazy pizza delivery cyclists, to aggressive dogs, to exploding manholes, and that was happening when I was living there, to cars, etc. So there are so many important things to pay attention to. We tried to convey to her, and she needed to stop paying attention to the butterflies. I later realized that when a student starts doing research and is admitted into a lab or has advisement sessions with her advisor, a similar process happens. The student is interested in the butterflies and colorful things in the world, and the advisor is all the time saying, no, that's a waste of time and of money. You have to finish your thesis, your scholarship does not last forever. There is not a chance that the path you want to follow will be productive. And so you have to do what I have been doing and what my colleagues and the institution have been doing. And if you want to be if you want to be a wheel in this machine, you have to at least look like and behave like a wheel. By the way, editors do exactly the same thing with young journalists. And in this process, the researcher, the thinker, the intellectual, the writer gets desensitized to many dimensions of the world and learn to pay attention to other specific things. It is in this context that there is the possibility that the world has ended and we didn't realize it. And we couldn't realize it because we have lost the sensibility about such things. Or for instance, what it means to die. We lost the sensibility to understand what it means to die. In other words, when can we declare that we are already dead as a civilization, for instance? Or even more importantly, how can we do it? Is it through academic research and writing? Or is it through journalism? Are these two good genres of communication and therefore genres of relating to the world for us to declare ourselves dead? The answer is no. And the reason for that is the extent to which journalism and science are integral parts of the forms of being in the world that generated the environmental crisis in the first place. And I'll get back to this later. Well, there are other approaches to the issue of why we can't perceive things that are right in front of us. So Aaron's approach focused on the bureaucracy that unites technique, the state, and capitalism, showing how it is a tremendously powerful machine for the reproduction of such states of affairs. Now, there are other approaches, like there's one proposed by Robert Proctor that is called agnotology. It is the science of ignorance. It is dedicated to understanding how ignorance is intentionally produced in massive scale and the effects it has in our existence. So climate change denialism would fit well here. In one way or the other, what we see as a result is things like these.
Hopefully, it starts raining and we won't be needed anymore, but for now it's definitely busy. The best part about it is we make people happy because people love their homes and we make them look better.
All right, now don't take this an attack on these specific individuals. Of course, it is not. This kind of thing is expected in a country so proud of its entrepreneurship like the US, right? But it shows how difficult it is to accept that things will not go back to same old. Well, yeah, the best sociology for addressing our lack of perception comes not from those who supposedly share similar perceptive conditionings with us, regardless of their sophisticated methodologies, and I'm sure that sociologists and anthropologists will promptly defend their preferred methods against the accusation that they obscure their perception. But from those who don't have them, and these people tend to live at the end of the world, at the end of our world, naturally. I'm using the expression the end of the world in its quote-unquote geographical sense, although a more appropriate term would be geological in the way that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari used it, or ontological. Now, Acre, the state of Acre in Brazil, where the School of the Forest was created, is at one of these ends of the world. For you to have an idea, it's much faster for me, who live in São Paulo, in southern Brazil, to reach Miami than to reach Cruzeiro do Sul in Acre. It is not because of distance, but because of the fact that Acre is only marginally connected to the main transportation networks in Brazil. The Amazon is in the curious situation where it is the end of the world, and at the same time, it is at the center of current international debates. But then we have to analyze what exactly of the Amazon is both at the end of the world or in the center of the debates. So trees as carbon sinks and biodiversity are at the center of international debates. Now, non-Western forms of understanding the world, and that includes the climate crisis, are at the end of the world aspect of it. So I am using the problematic term, quote-unquote, Western here, in a sense that is similar to Bruno Latour's moderns. not as a specific individual or group, but as a perceptive agenda, as an attitude towards reality, and one that combines the materialistic naturalism of science and the utilitarianism of the market, resulting in the transformation of literally every living and non-living being in this planet, humans included, into either lab subjects or economic resources to be exploited. And because of that, because this idea of West and Western people are not geographically bounded, there is a great amount of non-Western life in the so-called global North. So more often than not, lab subjects and economic resources are just two sides of the same Western coin. So I will exemplify my argument here through the analysis of what is perhaps the most dangerous creation of the Western civilization after climate change itself. And that is the planetary scale technological schemes to fix climate change, what is known as geoengineering. So I will contrast the way people in our world and people, or at the center of the world, understand and evaluate geoengineering with how certain traditional and non-Western collectivities understand the question of the manipulation of the atmosphere. Additionally, it would be too easy to confront the ideas of climate engineers or physicists with that of indigenous shamans. So what I'll do is I will contrast the ideas of environmentalists and scholars from the humanities and those of indigenous populations. So after a brief presentation of the concept and the current efforts in geoengineering, two cases will be presented and discussed here. One is related to the Yanomami Indians of the Amazon, through the thoughts of one of their most important shamans, Davi Kopenawa, and the other related to the Afro-Brazilian tradition of Umbanda, specifically the activities of the Coral Snake Chief Foundation, and you soon will understand what these are. Now, coming back to what geoengineering is, in the words of Clive Hamilton, an Australian philosopher who has been publishing about it, geoengineering refers to deliberate large-scale intervention in the climate system designed to counter global warming or offset some of its effects. And so generally speaking, such schemes are variations or combinations of the following, and you can see in this diagram. Manipulation of the cloud cover of the planet, the changing of the chemical composition of the oceans, or the covering of the planet with a layer of particles that reflect part of the solar radiation back into space. Regarding the oceans, the dominant schemes advocate the fertilization with iron, resulting in a mega expansion of algae that would sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Both the cloud manipulation solution and the spraying of sulfur particles into the stratosphere aim to reduce the amount of solar rays that reach the surface of the planet. In a way, it is replicating the effects of large volcanic eruptions of the past. Every time there is a large eruption, the temperature of the planet cools down a little bit. And there are other, still more fanciful solutions, such as the installation of mirrors in space, which aims to reducing the amount of heat that reaches the Earth. Now, geoengineering is the theme of heated international debates. Techno-billionaires, such as Bill Gates, believe that geoengineering is not just the only effective solution to climate change, given the lack of capacity of international diplomacy to address the problem, but also a potentially profitable industry. Conservatives in the United States, particularly those directly linked to the military-industrial complex from the times of the Cold War, see geoengineering as an opportunity to bring new life to sectors of the network of research think tanks in military technology by using geoengineering as a potential weapon. And this despite international regulations in place since 1977, banning meteorological warfare. Liberal scientists like Paul Crutzen, the recipient of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, who together with ecologist Eugene Stormer popularized the term Anthropocene, understand that geoengineering is far from being a desirable solution when compared with the alternative of reducing carbon emissions. They nevertheless say that the moment will come when making use of some type of geoengineering solution will probably become inevitable. Now, environmentalist philosophers and social scientists, on the other hand, refer to the topic with a mix of indignation and horror. The improvement in knowledge of climate systems during the last decades has made evident a greater degree of uncertainty and variability than previously imagined, rather than increasing the power of human actions over nature. Complex systems theory on the one hand, and the concept of trophic cascade, originated in ecology on the other, show that changes in any ecosystem generate multiple and interconnected reactions, many of which we cannot and may never be able to predict. There's a growing body of critical literature on geoengineering in the humanities. Many authors are incapable of discussing geoengineering without becoming exasperated. In Clive Hamilton's account particularly, Western societies are locked inside a complex web of factors that combines the fetishization of economic growth, individualistic and materialistic hedonism, and psychological mechanisms of cynicism and self-deception, like wishful thinking. In such a way that, despite the growing scientific consensus on what is going on in the atmosphere, the main capitalist societies in the United States in particular seem to have decided to walk towards the precipice, hoping that a technofix will save everyone at the last minute. And these are two books published by Clive Hamilton on the topic. Well, my argument here is that such exasperation reflects a sense of lack of alternatives. And my argument is that one reason for that may come from the fact that the discursive genre through which popularization of science and scientific journalism takes place, defining, as a result, how environmental debates take place in Western public spheres, is structured around the same bourgeois, capitalistic, ontological, and epistemological presuppositions that generated the climate crisis in the first place. So what I'm saying is, science shares much more than scientists would like to agree, the conceptual basis of the type of civilization that created the crisis. In the US and in Australia, in Norway, and many other places, logical arguments and clear facts seem to hold little political sway. Donna Haraway recently mentioned that the oil companies and the military have great interest in the disappearance of the ice in the Arctic, where around a third of Earth's natural gas deposits are located. Clive Hamilton points to the apparent irrationality of oil companies that deny the anthropogenic dimension of climate change, but at the same time fund geoengineering research. He also affirms that the American military complex banks on climate crisis, so geoengineering schemes can be put into effect without needing to pass through democratic debate, as typically occurs in emergency situations. Yet none of these arguments, evidence, facts, logical reasoning seem to be politically effective, not at least for changing the game. So therefore the exasperation, what then has political efficacy? So one productive way of approaching geoengineering is to think about the cosmopolitics of desires associated with it and its constitutive powers. This is a question that in a way transcends the ideas of biopower and governmentality proposed by Foucault. And it's not possible to think about the existential crisis humanity faces by focusing on factors that are strictly human or social. So the political economy of the factors in question effectively includes the elements themselves, so to speak. So, as has often been repeated, capitalism may not care about the atmosphere, but it is much more critical that the atmosphere is not preoccupied with capitalism. So more specifically, the way in which capitalism depends on the idea of externality and open systems from which undesired costs can be exported is coupled with certain forms of subjectivity, with their specific emotional grammars and patterns of perception. So after at least 3 centuries of disconnection, quote unquote, between scientific, capitalistic ontological schemes and the materiality of local contexts. And I'm using here this connection in a way that links Marx's alienation and Bruno Latour's purification. We now live in a situation of banality or environmental evil. So the environmental crisis makes evident there is something wicked about our perceptive and emotional patterns, and that they are intrinsically linked to our material and institutional configurations. Like deep environmentalism, where fences and laws separate humans from nature, is no more than a manifestation of this. For many progressive Westerners, the horror with which they contemplate geoengineering springs from the idea that, quote unquote, nature should be left alone. It is at this point that I think that traditional forms of thinking about and living with the environment present themselves as interesting analytical tools, to say the least. The point of interest in such forms of life is that they tend to understand their worlds as enclosed systems. Like probably none of you know what happens to your garbage after the garbage truck passes in front of your house and takes it away, right? So this is the idea of open system. You don't care. Now, if the world was an enclosed system and you had to relate to your garbage, you would be much more interested in. And the question is, most of indigenous populations in the Americas, they think of the world as enclosed, in the sense there's no place or somewhere where you can hide your garbage and pretend it doesn't exist. This fact manifests itself in many distinct forms, the common denominator being the relational approach to the environment. That is, the idea that the interaction with the environment is understood as connecting subjects, and therefore regulated by moral codes. What is even more interesting here is the fact that exactly because nature is thought of at one and the same time as both the agent and the outcome of transactions and actions of subjects, humans and non-humans, it is naturally understood as something, quote unquote, constructed. So the idea of constructing the atmosphere does not cause consternation for most traditional peoples, as long as it is done properly. It is the animistic ontological base, so the idea that there are subjectivities behind objects and animals and so on, which provides some degree of balance between the construction, this form of construction, and the plenitude of becoming of the involved beings. So in the remaining section of this text, I will discuss the two already mentioned cases in which the construction of the atmosphere takes place in Brazil. So the first, I'll talk about the Yanomami and the Amazon. And a few years ago, I published a paper in which I affirmed that the oldest and most deeply rooted meteorological theory in human history is the one that believes that it didn't rain or it rained too much, any variation of what happens in the atmosphere, because of the actions or sins of someone. It can be us, it can be the enemy inside or the enemy outside. So this formulation is a variation of what Mayor Douglas called the forensic theory of danger, and it can be found in the sacred texts of the Christian, the Muslim, and the Jewish traditions, for instance. Okay? Now, for animistic collectivities like the indigenous populations of the Americas, a more appropriate one and complementary is the one that says that there was beneficial rainfall because of the actions, rituals of someone, a shaman or a priest. So as you can see here, there is the focus on agency and direct action is more intense. What I want to discuss here is the idea present in many cultural traditions that the environment is not guided by some form of impersonal mechanism, as in the Newtonian universe. Not by a detached God, but by the group itself or by a special individual in the group. So the case I want to discuss here is related to the Yanomami people who inhabit what we call the frontier between Brazil and Venezuela. And here you can see, this is their reservation, And this is an amplified image of the reservation where it shows inside of the reservation where people found minerals and gold, which was a very unlucky thing for the Yanomami, because their reservation are invaded by all sorts of disturbing entities and individuals. So one of their shamans, David Kopenawa, recently published in French with French anthropologist Bruce Albert, a book that is the most detailed account of the Yanomami cosmology. The book is an extremely rich illustration of the different dimensions of the Yanomami universe. And here I want to call attention to just two things. The first is the idea that the skies are held in place by the constant maintenance carried out by shamans and their associate spiritual beings. And the second is that some of these spiritual beings incorporate in their actions, but also in their constitution, elements of the universe of the quote-unquote white people, including how they maintain the skies in place. So we'll talk a little bit about the cosmology of the Yanomami. According to Kopenawa, Omama is the creator of everything, and the Shapiri are spirits associated with what we call the natural world: animals, plants, geographical accidents, astronomical bodies or events, seasons, states of the atmosphere, and so forth. According to the book, and also other works in what is called Amerindian perspectivism, and we can discuss tomorrow what that is, given that these entities have a human essence, although they are associated with animals or other things, they will not necessarily have the appearance of that animal. So the process through which someone becomes a shaman consists in an arduous bodily, emotional, psychochemical, and spiritual training regarding the spiritual dimension. To become a shaman, one needs to construct a network of relations with the Shapiri spirits so as to be able to work with them in specific situations. I mentioned two passages of the book in which this is exemplified in situations directly connected to the maintenance of the skies. And the three editions of the book is being shown here. It was first published in French, and the next year it was translated into English, and only this year it is appearing in Portuguese. So in one of the first one we read, and I quote, "But one day, a long time from now, the sky will come apart and crush us all. But this will not happen so long as the shamans are alive to hold it up. It will lurch and roar, but it will not break. As soon as the sky starts to shake and threatens to crack, the shamans instantly send their Shapiri to reinforce it. Without that, it would have already collapsed long ago." In the second passage, the meaning of maintenance is a bit different. And I quote, "When the rain falls without interruption for days on end and the sky remains full of dark, low clouds, we start to get tired of it because they cannot hunt and they cannot do work in the gardens and so on. So eventually, we turn to our shaman elders for help, for they know the rain being Maari well, and can ask him to stop. So they drink the yakoana, which is the drink that gets them into an altered state of consciousness, and start working. Their spirits wash the sky chest and call the sun being Motokari and the being of the dry season Omoari. Then they turn the key that holds back the rain and bring light back to the sky. And finally, another passage introduces an interesting element in the composition of beings and strategies to deal with the atmosphere. And I quote, "Some Shapiri, such as the sloth spirit, possesses a rifle acquired from the spirits of the white people's ancestors. So he uses it to intimidate the thunders into becoming quiet and to fire at the evil beings and their hunting dogs." And I will not offer any kind of detailed analysis of the material just presented. I will rather proceed to the next ethnographic case, and I'll come back to that at the end. And the second case I want to show you is an institution called the Coral Snake Chief Foundation. It's an institution associated with the Afro-Brazilian religious tradition of the Umbanda, which operates in the business of producing or preventing rains in Brazil and elsewhere through the spiritual actions of the spirit of the coral snake chief. So this is a drawing of the coral snake chief, and that woman is the medium through which the spirit of the chief acts. In the last 20 years, this foundation has provided services to highly visible clients, such as the governments of the cities of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, and the entertainment company Artplan, producer of the Rock in Rio Festival since 1985. So these are perhaps the most visible clients of this foundation. And these are the official documents that demonstrate that indeed you do have contracts between, the municipal governments of. When I say municipal governments of São Paulo and Rio, it's equivalent to New York and Los Angeles in the United States. So we're not talking about small places with unsophisticated people. We're talking about the highest concentration of university and scientists in Brazil is exactly in São Paulo. Okay, and among other services, the foundation makes sure that there is no rain over Copacabana Beach on New Year's Eve, when one of the most remarkable fireworks spectacles in the world takes place. They have been working with the municipal government of Rio since 2001, so 15 years now. So Afro-Brazilian religious groups tend to be very discreet in their activities, especially when outside places considered centers of Afro-Brazilian culture, like Salvador in the state of Bahia or the city of Rio. Even in these places, however, they are subject to growing levels of hostility from neo-Pentecostal Protestant churches, what adds to centuries of discrimination from the white elites. In such a context, one of the most remarkable facts about a group of individuals gathered at the foundation is that they seek constant media exposure. So, Paulo Coelho, the best-selling Brazilian writer, was the vice president of the foundation between 2004 and 2006. And in that picture, you have Paulo Coelho with the medium that receives the spirit of the chief. Adelaide Scritori, the woman, and her husband, Osmar Santos, who act in the role of public relations of the foundation, make themselves present at the most important public events in Brazil and overseas. I'm going to give you an example. According to Maria Paula de Salvo, journalist of the Veja magazine, and it's the weekly news magazine with the highest circulation in Brazil, and the second highest in the Portuguese language in the world. When Pope Benedict XVI arrived in São Paulo in May 2009, on what the meteorological forecast predicted would be a rainy afternoon, it indeed rained, but it stopped at the moment the Pope left the airplane. According to Salvo, the journalist, Ronaldo Camargo, who was the adjunct secretary of the municipal government of the city of São Paulo, had called the foundation for logistical help in weather making, which means producing a dry weather for the Pope to visit São Paulo. From January to September 2009, the São Paulo city government requested the services of the foundation 6 times. Another example, Marcelo Taz is an award-winning journalist in Brazil, did a telephone interview with Osmar Santos the day after the opening ceremony of the London Olympic Games in 2012. And Santos told the journalist that, I quote, during the opening ceremony, Adelaide was in Dublin, Ireland, where she diverted the pressure waves coming from the north of the British Islands to Spain with the intention of alleviating the drought occurring in that country. Meanwhile, from inside the stadium, Osmar sent her real-time information about the weather in London. So this is published in Brazil. And the journalist ends his text with the phrase, I don't believe in witches, but they indeed exist. And in Brazil, we usually use the Spanish expression, right? No creo en las brujas, pero que las hay, las hay. Now, the History Channel interviewed César Maia, the mayor of Rio de Janeiro, where the contract with the foundation was signed. And César Maia said exactly the same thing. Well, he said that during the 8 years of his term in office, Rio was a dry island that could be observed in satellite photos. He said that to the History Channel. And then the journalist asked him whether it didn't appear like irrational or was not coherent that he presented himself as Catholic. And the former mayor replied that he is one, Brazilian, second, Carioca, which means a citizen of Rio, and Botafoguense. He's a fan of the Botafogo soccer team, and therefore he is superstitious. Well, according to the foundation, it does not charge for services provided to governmental entities, yet it demands that the recipient of the service reciprocate in kind, usually through some form of environmental program. As you can imagine, the activities of the foundation in Brazil are surrounded by controversy. Journalists who published articles about the work of the foundation, as Marcelo Taz did, are often subject to hostile online comments from readers. And all of that, in a way, is just a prologue for what is perhaps the most interesting dimension of the activities of the foundation, its relation with science. So in 1987, the Brazilian Meteorological Society denounced the foundation to the Regional Council of Engineering and Architecture of the state of São Paulo, alleging the illegal exercise of meteorological activity. So this institution called CREA is equivalent to what the American Bar Association is in the US for the practice of advocacy. So no engineer, agronomist, or meteorologist can work in Brazil without the proper permit from CREA. And the CREA institution is acknowledged as conservative in technical terms. In the last decades, innovative, non-traditional engineering courses recently created in Brazil, such as environmental engineering, for instance, have been facing great difficulties in getting CREA accreditation. In such circumstances, it was truly remarkable that CREA's verdict was in favor of the foundation. So the engineer Antero da Costa Santiago, responsible for evaluating and judging the process, in his report refers to the spiritual entities and their activities as facts of reality, even if outside the scope of science, and therefore of metrology. He then suggested the case to be shelved, as it subsequently occurred. Well, the foundation, nevertheless, charges for the services to private clients, like the Art Plan company that organizes Rock in Rio. And of course, as you can imagine, the whole idea is preventing rains during the concerts. So they charge the private clients. So in 1991, the regulation agency, CREA, demanded that the foundation request a permit for the exercise of metrology. And it also demanded that the foundation had a responsible metrologist in charge for the services provided. And at that moment, the foundation formalized the relation they had with a professor from the Department of Meteorology of the University of São Paulo, from whom it had been getting technical consultancy for the work of weather manipulation. This professor, that I'll call Ronaldo, it's a fictitious name, began acting as the foundation's technical director. More recently, a younger but similarly high-profile meteorologist from the Center for Weather and Climate Forecasting in the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research started providing similar consultancy services to the foundation. And of course, I really wanted to understand why a spiritual entity that incorporates in a medium needs scientific consultancy. So Ronaldo, the meteorologist, one of my main informants in this research, described how his first contact with Osmar and Adelaide took place in the mid-1980s, when he was a part-time professor and also produced weather forecasts for the newspaper O Estado de São Paulo, one of the main newspapers in Brazil. One morning, the telephone at the newsroom rang. It was Osmar, introducing himself as a member of the foundation and asking for very unusual information. What needed to be done to stop a cold front coming from the south from advancing over the state of Rio Grande do Sul in the following days. Well, the local meteorologist service did not attend his requests for information, and he therefore decided to call the newspaper, Vitamin. So Ronaldo answered that meteorology does not work by acting on weather phenomena, but only describing them. Well, Osmar insisted on the question, quote, if you could change the conditions of the atmosphere in order to do that, what would you do? Well, Ronaldo consulted the weather monitoring apparatus, did a few calculations, and informed Osmar that if the atmospheric pressure over the state increased and reached a certain level, it would probably weaken the cold front. Well, in the following day, the atmospheric pressure increased and the cold front disappeared. And, quote, I quote, I was astonished by this. There was no rational explanation for what had happened, Ronaldo told me. And Ronaldo is a very accomplished meteorologist in Brazil. And he got his PhD in the US. He was the first Brazilian to be in the Southern Pole. And he participated in over a dozen scientific expeditions to the Antarctic continent. So he was not a beginner. But the thing is, he decided to go on to see where things would lead. I mean, he was so interested in understanding what was going on. So he ended up providing services for the foundation for 15 years. Now, I interviewed Ronaldo and the meteorologist, and he affirms he has witnessed incredible atmospheric transformations associated to the activities of the foundation. He nevertheless says that he is not completely convinced in regard to how they explain what they do. So during the interview, he described one spiritual operation, and I will quote a chunk of interview. So Ronaldo says, I have seen that. They hold the cold front at the entrance of Rio. It's just like in Rock in Rio. It was incredible. An enormous cold front reaching the area, and they held it. They asked me, what should I do to block this cold front? Then I said, firstly, you need to strengthen the northeast winds to hold the front. Then you also have to change the western high true, slowing down its movement. And this idea of western high true is a meteorological technical expression. And I asked him, does the chief understand this jargon? So you're talking the language of scientists, and do you talk like this to the spirit? And he says, yes. Adelaide, the medium, often does not. And she asked for further explanations, but the spiritual entity, he does understand it. After 15 years working together, it's practically a meteorologist. And then he finishes, he says, all I know is that you looked at the radar image and could see a small island of dry weather over Rock in Rio. When asked whether meteorological equipment can detect and document the effects of the actions of the foundation, he said that it depends on the scale being analyzed. At larger scales, the effects are not spectacular, in his words. Sometimes they are very subtle. Like, for instance, total precipitation over large areas don't change. They may make a dry island here and the rains go elsewhere, but then when the total rains are computed, it didn't change. So the same applies for average temperature over long periods. So it seems that the foundation operates at a blind corner of meteorology. Yet, as mentioned above, in the weather scale, the actions seem to be detectable in equipment such as meteorological radars. In any case, the concept of natural atmospheric variation has been evoked by his peers, the peers of the meteorologists, through the last decade to delegitimize any attempt in the scientific documentation of the activities of the foundation. Now I will wrap it up and try to conclude. So it's likely that what I have just presented has provoked strong reactions among some of you. and many of you may perhaps be avidly waiting for me to dissolve this indigestible force of the material with some kind of philosophical theory or social science theory, like hermeneutics, post-colonial theory, whatever. But I'm not convinced of the convenience of reducing everything to a minimal common theoretical denominator at this moment. As mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the goal of my work here is to contrast, even if very roughly, different attitudes toward intentional transformations of the atmosphere and to reflect on the contrast itself. So the first, if we think about geoengineering and how people talk about geoengineering, and if we look at what the indigenous populations and the religious groups say they are doing, and you contrast one with the other, well, the first and perhaps the most obvious point here is that the discussion seems to highlight how it is not lack of knowledge or certainty that makes geoengineering risky. That's the most immediate idea. We should not do geoengineering because there's no way we will know what we're doing. So there's a specific understanding of knowledge and the application of knowledge. And for the indigenous populations, that's not the issue. Instead of lack of knowledge or certainty, what makes geoengineering risky is the absence of a moral debate regarding the relations between living organisms in this planet. So contrary to traditional approaches, the cosmopolitics of the desires of the universe of Western technical knowledge and action is hypothesized around desensitizing institutional apparatuses and desensitized subjectivities. So in the Yanomami's view, and also, although differently, the Umbanda tradition view, the actions of the quote-unquote white man, and this is a David Copenhagen's term, it doesn't have to do with skin color. So the actions of the white man are detrimental to the environment because they are asocial in a context in which everything is inside patterns of sociality. So what I'm saying here is the indigenous populations understand their relationship with the environment as a social relation. And because of that, it is regulated by moral codes and ethical concerns and so on. So the question all this raises is how to resocialize the de-enchanted world of naturalistic materialism that marks science. So I see advances on many fronts in recent years, from legislative reforms that give juridical rights to the environment, and that happened in Ecuador and Bolivia, right? Their constitutions give rights to nature. And also to non-human animals, like the dolphins were recently recognized as non-human persons in India. There's also a coordinated international wave of habeas corpus requests for chimpanzees in order to get them out of incarceration. That I follow that in Brazil and in Argentina, but there are many other places it's also happening. Now, another thing is there is this intensification of debates around the production and consumption of meat. Also, the popularization of social theories that approach sociotechnical apparatuses via new analytical frameworks, such as the actor network theory or the cyborg feminism of Donna Haraway, among many other things. So it seems to me that the weapons for revolution are already available, or at least it is in advanced development. Although revolution here may not be a huge cathartic event, and Donna Haraway referred to that. The second point, and this is a more complex and perhaps scarier point, is the following. When physics becomes metaphysics, and that is when there is a decentering of materialistic unilateralism, when the science becomes just one way of seeing the whole thing and not necessarily the privileged way of assessing reality. So How does one think about paraphysics? I'm using the term paraphysics in a way we have an expression, parapsychology, for instance. So what happens is what is known as the ontological turn in the social sciences and in philosophy turned the theoretical reflection towards places like Brazil, where not only we have never been modern, which is a title of a famous book by Bruno Latour, but in certain ways we have never abandoned animism. It also turned the reflection to places in Latin America where more than science fiction, what we have is magic realism as a key element in the collective imaginary. So is it possible to work with ideas such as another world is possible, multi-naturalism, ontological anarchy, which are expressions that are becoming more popular in this debate? Is it possible to work with all this and still remain associated with the gross Newtonian conception of the world that grounds modern anthropological thinking? So what I'm affirming here is that the physics of anthropologists are as bad as the anthropology of physics, of physicists. So that explains why it is so easy to reduce any bizarre manifestation of the material world to relations of power or to psychological illusions and so on. So the principle of symmetry suggests, in my understanding, that a symmetrical equivalent to the social studies of science and technology, which is a growing field in places like the US, so an equivalent to that would be a serious physical research into other realities. So it is in these circumstances that the Coral Snake Chief Foundation case is interesting, because what we see there could be called like a breach in ontic etiquette. There's no negation of the Western naturalistic ontology. It is not as what we see in the case of the evolutionism versus creationism debate in the US, where the language is being used is so different that no communication is possible among them. Here, what we have is a not so subtle public declaration that the Western ontology is just a subset of the chief's ontology. So the coral snake chief, he swallows the science and turns it into something else, like something else physically, media-wise, politically. So even if the interviewed meteorologists are reticent about it, references made in their very narratives regarding the possibility of verifying the reality of the meta-spiritual actions of the foundation through scientific equipment. So rather than ontological war, what we have here is something that resembles a metaphysical phagocytosis. So I hope it is clear at this point why I believe that initiatives like the School of the Forest are our only way out of the climate crisis we find ourselves. And as I mentioned, many worlds will have to be extinguished for that to take place. And that will not be easy. Thank you.
We have some time for questions. If you could please wait till you get the mic, because we're recording.
I'm curious to know if you have done similar kind of work with other indigenous communities around the world, like, for example, Peru, my country, perhaps others like Ecuador, Bolivia. I'm curious to know that.
Well, I have one colleague here at the University of Miami who is a film producer, and I participated in the production of one film with him. And when the film was released, he invited me to come to the opening, and it was at the university. And before the screening, there was a group of people talking, and he introduced me to someone who was the personal assistant of the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama was one of the individuals that was interviewed in the film. And I started talking with them, and then a woman who was one of the secretaries of the Department of Communications of the University of Miami told me that whenever a hurricane approached Florida, she would call him, the assistant of the Dalai Lama, wherever he was in the world, and ask him to pray in order to divert the hurricane. Well, she was not joking. So the climate was kind of weird in the conversation because some people felt like laughing, but she was not, and neither was the guy. And then he told, the monk said, I don't think I can do it, actually. But I have seen my master in Tibet climbing a mountain and stopping a storm. After I mentioned this case in Brazil last year, and after my presentation, a journalist came to talk to me, and he said, "Do you know the case of the forest fire in the state of Roraima in Brazil in 1998?" I said, "No, I don't know this." And he said, "Well, the state of Roraima was burning, so it was a huge wildfire, and the government was not capable of doing anything about it. So people at the Foundation for Indigenous Affairs in Brazil, they approached the government and said, can we try something? And the government said, okay, you can do whatever you want. So what they did is they got 2 shamans from the Mato Grosso state, and they flew them to Roraima, which is northern Brazil. And these 2 shamans spent 2 days doing a ritual. And then after 2 days, they come back and say, let's get out of here because it will rain a lot. And it rained so much that 95% of the fire was extinguished. Now, this is not the interesting part of the story because it happens all over the place. Just have to start talking to people, you see that everyone will have a story like this. Now, the interesting part is the Brazilian Senate decided to create a commission to study this. So, distinguished senators and technicians from the Brazilian Congress traveled to Roraima to understand what exactly happened. And they come back after a few weeks and they produce a report that is in the library of the Brazilian Congress, that the report says that that's exactly what happened. So 2 shamans came and they do the ritual and it rained a lot. And despite of the non-existence of any meteorological scientific signal that would happen. So it's very interesting. Wherever I go, I find histories like this. Another person told me that there is this international theater festival in Bogota, in Colombia. And it has been many years now that the municipal government of Bogota, they hired an indigenous leader to do rituals in order to prevent rains during there was a huge debate in Bogota because of that, because they were paying him with public money. And then the debate was, is it proper to use public money to pay this kind of service? Well, the municipal government didn't care. Politicians are way more pragmatic than scientists. So it was working, and they kept doing it. So I collect these stories, of course, right? So what I'm saying here is that the idea of multiple universes, as I said, of course, the idea of the School of the Forest is all about it, because the idea of the School of the Forest is you put scientists and indigenous leaders together around the same table and get them to talk. So the question is, how much a scientist will really hear what the Indian is talking? That's why it's so fascinating, these kind of huge examples of there's something going on that we don't understand. The idea that science mapped out everything already is nonsense. And you just have to go to philosophy of science, like Popper, Thomas Kuhn, Feyerabend. You're going to see that. Right? The idea that science knows all that exists is nonsense. And that's why I think it's the School of the Forest is so interesting, because according to what I presented, they have different ways of, we don't have to think like them, but the contrast with their perceptions of reality can, in a way, create tensions and differences in our perception of the world that you would not have otherwise.
Are you familiar with any examples of shamans being involved with acts of violence, where they're taking someone where there's, I'm not aware of them showing up like anyone bringing in a shaman to like Rwanda or in these cases where, because I'm familiar with the examples having to do with Mother Nature, but not human nature, and you had originally been talking about genocide and the inability for people wanting to accept that this is happening at multiple times while the things are occurring.
Yeah, that's a difficult question because, there's so many possible explanations why, things, when we think about nature and our relationship to nature as kind of a social relation, and before I try to answer your question, we just have to remember that one of the problems of addressing climate change now is that in the 16th century, or before the 16th century in Europe, whenever there was a drought, people believed that was divine punishment, right? So the idea that you're having divine punishment that comes to you in the form of a drought connects your actions with the atmosphere in a very strong way, right? So you act in appropriate or non-appropriate ways, and your relationship with God will bring it back to you in the form of rain or not. What happens with the scientific revolution in the 16th and 17th century is that those people convinced everyone else that you have nothing to do with that. It rains regardless of your actions. So there's no connection between whatever you think, whatever you do, morally speaking, and nature. And they were pretty successful, right? Across 300 years and 350 years. What happens now is that once again we realize that climate change has to do with our actions. It's a kind of short circuit, right? So after too long believing that we have nothing to do with that, now we realize we do have something to do with that, but we don't know how to behave anymore. So one of the things about the School of the Forest is actually constructing alternative forms of action. Now going back to the question of not always shamans are praised or respected and so on. Well, one of the questions here, when you work with non-Western populations, one of the interesting questions is how they understand death and life and body and so on. So the understanding is very different. Very often in some ethnicities of indigenous populations, one way of trying to resolve a huge environmental crisis is actually killing the shaman. Right? So that is not unheard of. Actually, there's a book by Herman Hesse, the Glad Glass Bead Game, in which the last story is about exactly that. I mean, a shaman is sacrificed in order to deal with an environmental crisis. Now, it's very hard to understand how the role of death and the role of violence, because the way they understand body and life and so on is so different from ours. So Mauro, Mauro Almeida, the first presenter in the series of seminars, he once told me that he was in Acre, in the forest, and of course you cannot get into the forest without a guide, otherwise you don't get out, right? So the guide was an indigenous person, and Mauro was taking a group of biologists with him. And at some point the guide stops and says, you see this ant here, and you see these vines. This ant and these vines are the same thing, so these ants turn into vines. And then the biologists didn't like it because you're talking about an animal that turns into a vegetable, right? And it's not accepted in our modern scientific taxonomy of beings and so on. So the idea for the Indian was, no, there is a metamorphosis going on. So this ant turns into vine. Well, a few years later, Mauro finds out a research that describes how there is a fungus that turns the ants into zombies. So this fungus takes control of the nervous system of the ant, and the ant goes to the top of the trees and dies there. In doing that, the ant carries the seeds of the vines in its body to the top of the tree, and that's why sometimes the vine sprouts from inside of the body of the ant. Right? But the interesting thing about this story is that both were right. There's no one is wrong here. But clearly we see that there is a difference. And one of the differences is what they understand as body is another thing. Right? The idea that shamans can turn into jaguars is very common in the Amazon. And once again, how do you get scientists and shamans around the same table? Oh, let me give you another example. It's very interesting. Davi Kopenawa, once he was making a presentation in Rio, and he said, we the shamans, we are so concerned about climate change, and we have been working on it for many years now through our shamanic activities. And then it comes the most interesting part. He says, whatever the equipments of the white people can perceive of climate change, it's only that we could not fix yet. So what he says is shamans are mitigating climate change for a long time now, but we cannot fix it. And that's what you perceive in your scientific equipments. It's only what shamans couldn't solve. And I have a meteorologist friend, he gets very angry with these kind of things, very angry. And then once I remember I told him, I said, this Indian shaman, he wants exactly, this meteorologist friend of mine is a very intense activists about environmental issues and climate change, right? And then I told him, you get the shaman Indian and you have the same agenda, but you don't understand reality in the same way, but you do have the same agenda, which is saving the forest. Now, you go to the oil companies, they understand reality exactly how you do, but you don't have the same agenda. So what is preferable? To work with someone who has the same agenda that you have, even if he or she doesn't think the way, don't understand reality as you do, or should we just how much is really needed that we have to convince everyone around this planet that the only appropriate way of talking about climate change is the scientific one? And that's the point of the School of the Forest. School of the Forest is not a place where Indians go to learn with scientists. It is a place where different forms of knowledge interact with each other. And what comes out of it is, of course, an ongoing process.
So I have a question about a completely different system of thought, which is the financial system of thought. I read recently that there has been movement among certain financial entities, particularly pension funds and other kinds of groups that are responsible for paying out dividends like 50, 60 years in the future. They're very long term. That they've been reallocating resources toward renewables, infrastructure that's intended to mitigate climate change effects. And I didn't read specifically about investment in geoengineering, but I think that would be really interesting to find out, along the Bill Gates kind of approach. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the implications of something like this. I mean, for starters, to me it's striking that you'll have the financial guys kind of confronting the prospect of climate change, right? And if the policymakers will believe any truth or any perspective, it'll be from the financial market. So that's one implication, but I think there are many others. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
You probably all heard that if all human individuals in this planet reach the level of consumption of European nations or United States, we would need 5 extra Earths in order to get resources, right? This is a message that has been going around and around and around. So it's not only about energy sources, it's also about consumption. So I agree. I mean, China has been investing massively in renewable energy. Probably China will be the country with cleanest energy networks in a few decades. But it's not only that, right? It's not only that. I mean, one of the things is how can we go back to accepting that we only have one Earth at our disposal, and we have to equate levels of consumption around the planet, including the efforts of reducing poverty or eventually ending poverty and so on, right? I don't see the financial markets doing anything about it. So, I mean, what I'm saying is I don't think it goes that far. I think that, finance investing in future clean energy is absolutely necessary. But there are so many other problems that we are not addressing, and one of them, which I think is the most emotionally disturbing, is the issue of consumption. Can you imagine the United States consuming a fifth of what it consumes? Can you imagine your life consuming a fifth of what you consume? The amount of courage that we need to confront these challenges is very high. Now, that's an interesting thing about indigenous populations, because very often they, instead of development, the concept of sufficiency is more important for them, right? So the idea about living in an indigenous lifestyle is that you have to create. Well, let me give you an example. Practically all Native American groups in the United States, but also in the Amazon, don't have police. In the highlands of Central America, the traditional peoples, they did have a lot of stratification, the Maya, the Aztecs, the Inca, but you look at lowland Amazonia and in northern North America, you have populations without police. Can you imagine a world without police? Can you imagine Miami without police? So how can they work? And they have been doing this for 20,000 years. How can they survive without police? So one of the things is the amount of self-control that they have to learn is enormous. It's not only that you don't have police, because you don't have police, the chief cannot impose his will on the other Indians. Actually, an Indian doesn't take orders from no one. That's the point. So the chief usually is a very good a person who does conflict resolution and is charismatic and so on, right? Has to be very socially intelligent, but the chief very rarely can impose his will and so on. Now, it's very interesting when we compare to our society, because our society is all the time telling us that we have to be happy, we have to release ourselves from any kind of constraints, right? And so we have to open up and live a full life and so on, and then we surround ourselves with control, right? But police is one of them. So you have a lot of control outside of you. So you don't need to have control inside of you. And then if you have too much control, you have to go do therapy to release yourself. Now for the Indians, it's different, because they have to have a lot of self-control. And they do. And that's why an Indian, in general, when he or she speaks, he or she mean it. And one of the things about Indians talking with white people is that for them, we speak endlessly, and 85% of what we say is nonsense. Because there's no self-control. We just talk, right? And now, the idea of sufficiency and the idea that I do think that this kind of subjectivity that is created in Amerindian societies, not only in what concerns the political institutions that regulate indigenous life, but also how they relate to nature, is one of the key things that we need to face if we are really going to address the question of consumption. So what I'm saying is, I mentioned the trash, right? I mean, you fill your garbage can and the truck takes it somewhere, you don't care, you don't want to know, you pay the municipal government in order to not be able to think about it. But it happens with all other things. Now, consumption of meat, for instance, right? It's another interesting thing about the Indians, because they really believe that there is a human soul in the animals, but they're not vegetarian. So if they're not vegetarian, and if they believe that there is a human soul in the animals, when they eat an animal, what are they doing potentially? Cannibalism. That's right. So there are all sorts of symbolic and spiritual technologies in order to prepare meat in order to be eaten. But one of the things is you have to treat the body of the animal that you're going to eat with an extreme amount of respect. There are things you cannot do with the body of a dead animal. So when Indians come to the city and they see the amount of food that we trash, this is the most uncivilized thing that they can find among us. The lack of respect with the bodies of the animals. So this is one example of a change in perspective that immediately causes us to, in a way, well, it not necessarily does it, but it can, reframe things for us, and the amount of leftovers and trash that we produce can be reduced, right? If we see behind this smoke screen that we set up all the time in order not to confront these kind of things, right? Now, the School of the Forest has another thing about the financial system is, Mauro, he didn't say this in his presentation, but in a conversation he said, there was an incompatibility between the idea of the School of the Forest in terms of institutional organization and the university, because the university is a very strong institution in terms of bureaucracy, and there are ways of organizing things in a university that are not necessarily compatible with the idea of bringing indigenous leaders and having them meet with the scientists. So in a way, that is revealing. When I say that some words will have to end, and this is going to be painful for us because we learned to like them, I wonder whether universities really can help us to address the future, as I said, and I wonder whether journalism can help us. Of course, I'm being extreme, right? I'm being provocative, but there is a thing there in terms of reorganizing our perception of the world is reorganizing our economy, necessarily, right? So people investing in green energy for 30 years from now, but still, consuming in the level of consumption they have and producing the garbage and consuming meat as they do and so on, it's just a small fraction of what could be done, and it's probably was not going to be good enough in terms of the crises that are waiting.
Before we take our last question, I just want to ask if you could fill out your surveys that you got on the other side of the speaker bios. That helps for public programming here at PAN, and we'll have our last question.
Hello. With the issues that you described and the shamans being able to alter the meteorology, in São Paulo, being the lack of water that's there, are they being asked to help there? Or is that one of the spots where we see what the action is not being done yet?
That's a very good question. And that's why the people at the foundation, the Coral Chief Snake Foundation, avoided me for a long time because they thought I was a journalist and I was trying to ask them exactly the same question that you asked. If they can't produce rains, how come São Paulo is going through this huge drought? Well, the answer that I received from them is very interesting because it illustrates what I'm trying to say here. It is not that what they say they do is not about having raw power over the environment, but there is some form of moral relation in the relation between humans and the environment. And what they told me is that they could not do it. So there was something cosmic in the sense that, you know, there were a series of mistakes in the past in the management of water in São Paulo, and there was nothing they could do. Which is interesting, right? Because we tend to think that these are, you know, those kind of cartoon type religious shamans that can do anything. And their answer is, this one we cannot solve. Right? But of course they have to face a lot of public pressure. So the more they appear on the media, the more they have to confront this kind of question. So if you can produce rains, why not now and here, right? But so what they said is, well, there's something bigger going on in terms of the ecological crisis, and there is a pedagogical dimension of it, or something like this. Don't remember exactly how they said that, but the big thing is there's nothing we can do regardless that now. Now they have been traveling to the rivers that feed the São Paulo city in order to, you know, do something. I still could not be with them in their, what they call the spiritual operations. My research at this point was with the scientists that provide technical service to the foundation. But you're right, I mean, they just said that this one they cannot solve.
Thank you. Join me in thanking Dr.